Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and my sincere apologies for the technical challenges we are having. I'm going to ask everyone if they can pop themselves on mute if they can, because we are running this now as just a normal Teams meeting rather than as a webinar. Thank you so much for your enduring patience. If you are watching this online through a recording afterwards, because you couldn't get in, my sincere apologies. I'm still not sure what's gone wrong with it, but we are doing our best to try and figure it out and adapt on the fly, which, as we know in this sector, is something that we really need to be able to do. My name is Kate Brady. I am the Senior Researcher at the University of New South Wales HowWeSurvive initiative, and I'm very happy to be here with you all today. Working with Disasters is a partnership initiative that we have with the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience. It's a new short-form professional development program which is aimed at people in a whole range of different professions who wouldn't necessarily see themselves as being disaster managers, but we know have an enormous influence on the lives of disaster-affected people. I am coming to you from the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people, so in Melbourne, and I pay my respects to the custodians of this land and the lands that you are all on, because you're coming from all different parts of Australia and in some cases from other countries. I'm going to be introducing the speakers that we have as they come up, and because we are now operating on a bit more of a truncated time frame, and I thank you again all for your patience and your adaptation with this. What we'll be doing is I'll be introducing each of the speakers as they go. They will be presenting. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions still at the end, but I'll also be inviting you to put your questions into the chat, and anything that we don't get to, we will send through in a follow-up email to all participants at the end. We'll try and collate some responses and send them all to you. Now, the first person I'd like to invite to unmute themselves is Louise Hayes. Louise is the Coordinator for Disaster Recovery at Financial Counselling Australia, and this webinar owes its existence to her, although none of the tech issues are on her, they are solely on me. When we started this series with the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, Louise got in touch with us and said, how do we include financial counsellors in this? And this is how it's come to be. So Louise, welcome, and if you can tell us a bit about yourself and Financial Counsellors Australia.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for the lovely introduction and for sorting out the IT issues. We're all very glad that the webinar is able to go ahead today. On a personal note, I'm absolutely delighted and feel very privileged that financial counselling sector has been selected to be a part of this incredible webinar program. Financial Counselling Australia, as the national peak body for the financial counselling profession, is really proud to be associated with the program. And I really would like to thank both HowWeSurvive and ADA, the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, for creating this unique, insightful and incredibly important program. For those of you in the webinar who are not financial counsellors are qualified professionals who support those who are experiencing financial hardship, and they provide free, confidential and independent support regardless of a person's income. As we would all be aware, and many of us have personally experienced, there has been an increase in the frequency and intensity of disasters over recent years. And financial counsellors across the country have been working very consistently supporting disaster impacted communities since the 2018-2019 Black Summer bushfires, and have in fact supported over 30,000 Australians since these fires. As a sector, we have grown and matured in our understanding of what it means to support communities through all phases of recovery. Unfortunately, along with the increase in frequency of disasters, there has been a loss of the financial safety net that used to exist to support community members impacted by a disaster. And until recently, I think it would be fair to say that those impacted by a disaster were either financially supported through an insurance policy, or if they were uninsured, through government-funded disaster support. However, what we're now seeing, in line with an increase in the frequency of disasters, is an increase in the number of community members who are underinsured or unable to access insurance and are therefore uninsured. And this is resulting in a growing cohort of people who have no financial safety net to support them recover in the event of a disaster. Research clearly shows that secondary stresses to disasters or those chronic indirect consequences and hardships and obstacles that arise after a disaster can have prolonged knock-on effects that hinder long-term recovery. And insurance and financial strain are among the worst secondary stresses on disaster-impacted community members. The growing insurance gap, or the difference between the amount of insurance in place and the actual cost of recovery, has made the work of a financial counsellor supporting disaster impacted community members more vital, but also more challenging. We also know that how we do this work is also very important, and disaster financial counsellors see every day that the trauma from engagement after a disaster can be worse on a disaster impacted community member than the trauma from the disaster itself. So therefore, what we do or do not do can support recovery, or it can compound the damage caused by the event. Financial Counselling Australia supports financial counsellors working in disaster impacted communities and provides disaster recovery training to financial counsellors, as well as a host of resources to support both casework as well as providing client-facing resources. I am really excited and look forward to hearing from and learning from today's speakers, Lisa Gage from Northern Rivers Financial Counselling Service, Erin Easton from the Port Douglas Community Service Network, and Dr. Monica Taylor from QUT.
Thanks so much, Louise. And as the first speaker, I'd like to welcome Monica Taylor. As Louise just said, Monica is from QUT. She's a legal academic with expertise in climate disaster justice. In her PhD, Monica examined how climate change affects everyday legal problems and how prepared Australia's legal assistance sector is to meet those changing needs. Monica is currently researching how laws can better protect people from the harmful impacts of extreme heat and the importance of a human rights respecting emergency and disaster management framework. Thank you, Monica.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm just checking that you can see the slides and hear me okay. Wonderful. Amazing job with the pivot to the meeting. Congratulations, working under pressure, Kate. You're so brilliant at it. Hi, everybody. I'm joining you from QUT, and I do want to acknowledge and pay my deepest respect to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. They are the First Nations owners and custodians of the land where QUT now stands. I want to recognise that there's, I guess, some hurt in the community at the moment with the decision to build the Olympic Stadium. That's just down from where QUT is located, and so just really want to, I guess, call out the strength, resilience and wisdom of First Nations elders in continuing to care for country. Okay, so I am coming to you as a person who has a legal background. I've worked for a long time in community legal centres, although that was quite a while ago now, in homelessness, mental health, disability, and working with tenants in the residential tenancy space and in social housing. Community legal centres are part of the Australian social safety net for legal assistance. So we have this big legal assistance sector. And so what I want to do a little bit today is speak about that sector working alongside the financial counselling services. So in these images, just to give you a bit of colour and movement of the sector, there are flood recovery lawyers, social workers, financial counsellors, First Nations lawyers. Hopefully, I wanted to kind of start with a bit of a picture of integrated service provision, because we know, and the research does say, that when the different professions come together, and that is the back end of doing that integrated work, that is what client-centred service delivery can really achieve, and that is what is best practice. But lawyers have different skills. Financial counsellors have a huge level of expertise in this disaster recovery space. And so that is what I'm going to spend just a little bit of time stepping everybody through. So in terms of the impacts of disasters, I'll keep this fairly high level. I've chosen sort of 6 things to drill down into. The research really obviously tells us that disasters expose and deepen social inequalities. Robert Verchick is the researcher who coined the term disaster justice. And he talks about the heaviest burdens of disaster being borne by those with the least power in society. And we know that instinctively in the work that we do, but it's absolutely backed up in the research. What else do we know? We know that people experiencing a disaster will have problems that pre-exist that particular event, and a disaster exacerbates the struggles that people are already facing in their everyday lives and creates new problems. I did see that a lot in my PhD work, talking to lawyers who were in disaster recovery services and centres. And one of the comments that struck with me was a lawyer saying, look, I really think the pit is getting deeper for people. We're seeing a broadening out of need, and that is being reflected in the numbers of people coming to seek assistance that haven't ever really found they needed to do so previously or prior to a disaster. We know that in terms of service delivery, a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. Every disaster is different. Every community is unique. And so a mantra that often comes through in the work of community legal centres doing disaster recovery work is expect the unexpected. Don't make assumptions, obviously, about the legal problems of the people that are coming for assistance. And number 4 and 5, problems are hard to spot. They can be hidden. They're really entangled. The impact of trauma on people who've gone through a disaster has a very big role to play in that entanglement. But what we are seeing and what the research is showing is there is increasing complexity. So legal problems getting tied up with financial problems, with social and emotional dimensions as well. And so unpicking that kind of mess and entanglement is where knowing what the skill sets that we individually provide can be so very important. And of course, our systems and our processes are really poorly designed for disasters. That's across the board. So it's not just legal systems, court structures, laws and policies. It is banking systems, it's the taxation system, it's the education system. These systems are designed for business as usual, and of course that goes out the door when a hazard strikes, and that creates barriers for people and barriers for service, people delivering services in trying to navigate problem resolution. This is some of the predictable problems. Lawyers tend to be very good at compartmentalizing problems, but problems, of course, they're not legal, they're just everyday problems. And so the way this I guess shopping list looks might sound a little bit different depending on the language that is used in financial counselling. And this list is also not necessarily exhaustive or in a list of priority, but I will say that tenancy and housing is, one of the largest issues that certainly community lawyers are dealing with, and those problems have a real temporal dimension to them. So they can be some of the first issues that people face in disaster recovery, particularly if a person's home is no longer habitable, a tenant wants to vacate and end the tenancy, or they may want to maintain that tenancy as well. The areas that I've bolded are kind of my best guess at the sort of area of work where the expertise of financial counsellors really, really shines. But I'm absolutely going to leave that to Lisa and Erin to drill down into the nitty-gritty of those problems. I will say that in the legal space, the Financial Rights Legal Centre is a national community legal centre that has genuine expertise in insurance law, and I've provided a link for that great, so you'll see at the end of these slides. So I just want to very quickly touch on some observations about integrated service provision and lawyers and financial counsellors working together in disaster recovery. So yeah, in the spirit of that, I found some dog photos on the internet, and yeah, maybe there's some dog and cat lovers amongst you, so you can decide which one might be the lawyer and which one might be the financial counsellor. But they're both two really, really large service systems, the legal assistance sector and financial counselling, and there are a lot of similarities. Both government funded for the most part, funding constrained, providing services where there is higher demand than there is supply available. Both professional service systems, but there is a different legal, ethical and professional structure that underpins how advice is delivered from one side or the other. So there is this blurry line, and I think as practitioners, that's one thing that is all that is needed, is to be really mindful about where that line is in the work that we do, in the community that we service, and the organisation that we're involved in. So there's no hard and fast rule necessarily. The goal is this final bullet point, all the words, integrated, joined up services, and that's what's going to provide the best outcome for a client. So just some observations about lawyers and their role in disaster recovery. So the legal issues on that previous slide often will spill into the areas that fall outside financial, and when things become really kind of specialist is when, you know, lawyers might have more of a role to play. The main point I want to say here, though, is just the absolute value that lawyers hold for the expertise of financial counsellors in disaster recovery. Often the work that you all do is more, I was going to say, is more important. It is practical, it is common sense, it gets to an outcome that sometimes lawyers can be a little bit more constrained in their in the way in which they can resolve a problem. The third bullet point there, unpacking and challenging a decision maker's discretion. Decisions that are made by government agencies that can really have genuine impacts on people's recovery trajectory. Those decisions, you know, fall into this area of discretion a lot of times, and that's where lawyers in their toolkit have, I think, the ability to really sort of to make a really good contribution. And these are some observations of, you know, where we see financial counsellors, but it is not my role at all to define the work of financial counsellors in disaster recovery. But from the legal side, general observations are incredible strident institutional advocacy with creditors, banks and the ATO, this hugely connective role in assisting clients to navigate services in that recovery, that long tail of recovery, and all of the practical assistance through financial literacy and understanding the financial implications, for example, of insurance in the kind of the long recovery tail. Just some final takeaways for all of you, that disasters really affect every facet of a person's life, and that holistic service provision is really ideal. And we have this complementarity, and understanding who does what in that kind of space is what's going to give a client the best sort of the best sort what they need in recovering from a disaster. So there's some more information there for you to all have a look. Thank you again for the invitation to present. I'm really looking forward to hearing Lisa and Erin talk and having a conversation.
Thanks so much, Monica. We really appreciate your presentation. We will make the links that Monica has provided available afterwards. I'll send a follow-up meeting basically still apologizing to everyone, but then also with the links and a summary of any of the questions that people have asked and any resources that are provided throughout it. So you'll be able to access them there. If you have any questions for Monica, please keep putting them in the chat so that we can try and answer them as we go, or answer them at the end, if we still have time. Our next speaker is Lisa. Lisa Gage is a financial counsellor with the Northern Rivers Financial Counselling Service based in Casino in New South Wales. Lisa has been a flood recovery financial counsellor in the Northern Rivers for 3.5 years and 1 year in a generalist role. Prior to working in this role, she worked in Western Australia for 4 years as both a generalist financial counsellor and a youth financial counsellor. Lisa has a background in finance, counselling and art therapy, so a really great combination of skills. She sees working in the financial counselling sector as a privilege, allowing her to work as an advocate, a financial mentor and an educator. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate, for that introduction, and Monica for your amazing presentation. As I've mentioned, or Monica mentioned, there's a really close association between financial counsellors and the legal sector, particularly in disaster. So I'm just going to share my screen. So can everyone see that okay? Yeah, great. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about financial counselling and where we sit within the disaster space. I'm part of the Northern Rivers Financial Counselling Service, and our area is Northern Rivers, New South Wales. And so I started as a financial counsellor in disaster work in 2022. When the region was hit by the flood, and the flooding event was from Tweed to Lismore down to Richmond Valley and Ballina Shire, so a huge area on the Bundjalung land that was hit by the disaster. And so where we sat in a generalist financial counselling role, we now had to step into disaster work, which was so very different. So financial counselling generally, for those that aren't aware, financial counselling, we sit as a generalist role, work in budgeting and money management, advocacy, working with banks and creditors, a lot of people in financial hardship, and so that ranges, as mentioned before, it's not about income, it's about hardship generally, and working with a range of different services and supporting people to move through their hardship and their difficulties. What we don't do is provide financial aid or material aid, legal advice, and those specialist financial planning, investment advice, tax and retirement planning and therapeutic counselling. So we're really specific within a space, and it's really important as a generalist financial counsellor to stay within that space. However, when disaster hits, during the disaster recovery, that role changes and changed quite significantly. There's an extra layer when through the flood recovery as a disaster financial counsellor. You're working with people in trauma. You're working with a whole community that have lost pretty much everything, their paperwork, ID, their businesses, their homes. There's an extra level of stress. And the people who have experienced financial hardship, it's no longer focused on a certain sector of the community. The entire community is impacted. And so people who once upon a time were absolutely fine prior to financially prior to the flood have now had to reassess everything, have had to navigate services, have had to navigate their insurance policies and their mortgages. And the way that each individual has dealt with that impact of the trauma of the disaster is very different. And so the capacity to think clearly, the capacity to navigate how to move forward is very different and very difficult. And some people can manage and others just have no idea how to move forward. And so as a financial counsellor, our main area, I believe, as our strength is we sit within that social services and community services framework. We work on the ground with community and we're the advocates. That's the first point of contact, is being part of the community as advocate and holding the hand basically, and creating practical pathways forward and helping people bring those pieces together and how to negotiate and work out where they need to go to start recovering, to get through the initial stage. And so this was 2022. We're now in 2026, and we're 4 years on, and I'm still working with people in this area where the needs now are different, how we have to move forward. And so it's a long process. So our main area of strength is in the advocacy and support and the referrals and collaboration. And as Monica mentioned, working closely with services and is absolutely imperative when we're talking about working in disaster, because best practice is that the community needs a range of different supports. And so it's so important to stay within your lane, I believe. And that's one of the biggest things that I think I've learned in this role, is the importance of collaborating with other services. So some of the key issues that I noticed in the years that I've been doing this, from the very beginning in 2022, when I've never done this before, to where I sit today, is all of the systems. You have to support people with working through the systems, because with banking and finance, they've got a financial hardship policy, but it's not set up for disaster recovery. It's a completely different argument. It's a completely different goalpost of need for people, working with people with their mortgages, credit cards, debt collecting agencies. Any problem that was under the surface prior to a flood now comes up to the surface to be looked at and becomes a crisis. So working and advocating on behalf of people in that space is absolutely essential, and it becomes a very different situation because of the impact that disaster has had with regards to the trauma and the capacity to be able to think clearly and work through a situation clearly. Employment has changed, income has changed, capacity to go back to work has changed. And a lot of people can't simply go back to what they were doing before because they're having to rebuild their homes. So the negotiating and advocating to establish a fair and reasonable outcome, fighting from a different standing point of disaster and trauma and vulnerability, where someone wasn't vulnerable but now becomes vulnerable because of the disaster. As Louise mentioned, the insurance is a huge part in this, and working through and helping people negotiate the process, advocating people who are highly vulnerable and cannot understand the policy documents and where they sit, supporting through that process. And then where we work closely with the legal team and the disaster legal team is when it does hit those brick walls, when we can't work out, or when we're finding it difficult with the insurance companies and we're then having to negotiate in a legal framework. That's when we have to be working with the legal team. And so we work very closely where, as a financial counsellor, we provide the advocacy and support, and we work together closely with the legal team, disaster legal team, who can then work their magic when it comes to what are the legal implications and how do we work with those policies. And other issues that come through and significantly through a disaster is councils, negotiating with councils. Every council has a different hardship policy. And then when disaster hits, the whole community has been impacted, particularly, in this region, the council's revenue, which is rates and water, everything changes. People don't have the capacity to pay. And so we were lucky enough to get some grants from the government to support with some of those rates in the first 12 months. But a lot of the council members don't have an understanding of financial hardship policies. So it's important for financial counsellors to have the awareness of the financial hardship policies in each council, which differ per council, but also then taking it to the space of disaster response, which is different again. Working with services, electricity companies, and this is an interesting one. I've got an example actually of the Cabbage Tree Island community. The flood impacted the community. The whole community was evacuated. They weren't able to go back to their homes. They were living in pod villages, and the electricity companies were still charging the usage of homes that had been evacuated. And so I was having to negotiate 2 or 3 years on from that time with community members that were, had a barrier to engaging with services. A lot of the First Nations community worked together closely post-flood, and so they supported each other, and so they weren't reaching out to financial counsellors as such, and so trying to pay these debts without the awareness of what we can do as financial counsellors. And so eventually it came to light that this was happening, and so we were able to get in there and start negotiating with those electric companies that just didn't know that the community couldn't move back and hadn't moved back into their homes 4 years on. So that was a really interesting case. And then small businesses. So small businesses obviously are impacted significantly. They're not able to operate, particularly in Lismore. It was the whole town was inundated with floodwater, and so small businesses had to start from the very beginning. And because it's small business under the National Credit Code, it's primarily to support consumer credit and not small business lending. So we had to take a different approach with small businesses that had lending issues around what they could do, particularly from a disaster space as well. So we were looking at having to negotiate with creditors for fair outcomes on lots of different levels, cash flow issues, rebuilding the businesses, and then 4 years on, we've now got tax issues for small business post-flood. So this is such a long, drawn-out process for financial counsellors, and the awareness that it doesn't stop after 12 months and everything's fine. It's just such a long lag to what we have to do. And I think as a financial counsellor, you have to think outside the box as well, because there's the issues are so widespread. And it impacts so many different people in different parts of the community. And so one of the, the key takeaway is it's a different way of working. It's much more hands-on and more practical as a financial counsellor. You're working deeply within the impacted community. As a financial counsellor, you're part of the community. They're your friends, they're your neighbours, they're yourself. And so there's risk of burnout. And so there's real importance for self-care for any financial counsellors that are listening. I think it's really important to be aware of that when you're working in disaster recovery. As I mentioned, the client issues are different. It's a practical, supported approach, as opposed to a generalist approach, where often you can move through a case and have closure within, a couple of months. With this, it can be drawn out over years, and people's capacities to function and think clearly change, and the people that come to the service become very broad, and so people that have never used financial counselling before will be reaching out for the first time. Like I said, greater level of advocacy and support, and and finally, as mentioned, it's collaboration. It's so important to collaborate with other services and specialists in their role. Important to set boundaries as well around what we can do as financial counsellor, and to be very clear when we cross the line. To stay in your lane is something that I've often used, is I stay in my lane. I'm not a therapeutic counsellor. I'm not here to support people through their trauma. There's specialists on the ground that do that. So it's really, and working with community as well. So it's really important to ensure that you are providing as many referrals as you possibly can, because there are so many people in this region in particular. There were so many services that were operating that it was important to be able to reach out and connect people to those services that they need to help them through their recovery. And I think, yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We really appreciate your insights. You're really in the thick of it, and the insights that you're bringing to us are so helpful. Our final speaker for today is Erin Easton. Erin Easton is a family and financial resilience coordinator at the Port Douglas Community Service Network in Far North Queensland. Erin also worked in a temporary role as a Community Recovery Connect worker, assisting those affected by Tropical Cyclone Jasper and the major flooding that followed. Erin and her family were also significantly impacted by Tropical Cyclone Jasper in December 2023 and sought support from financial counsellors through a chance encounter with a financial counsellor. Erin brings a deep level of insight and empathy to understand the trauma of experiencing a disaster and the difficulties people can face as they navigate recovery. Now, just before I hand over to Erin, if I can remind everyone to keep putting questions into the chat and we'll try and get to them at the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I probably don't need to introduce myself. I've just been introduced by Kate. Today, I'll be speaking from both a professional perspective and lived experience. As you just heard, I lost my home in the December 2023 floods after Cyclone Jasper in Far North Queensland. Before I get into it, I just want to say that some of what I speak about might feel a little bit close to home for some people, particularly those with lived experience. So please take a breather if you need to at any point. One thing I want to say right from the start, because it really shapes everything that comes after, is that in my lived disaster experience, which was major flooding, we had no warning that it was coming, none at all. So after the cyclone, what happened was our communications were completely down. So there was no phone, there was no internet, there was nothing. So while flooding had already started happening in surrounding areas, we had no idea it was coming. Nobody knocked on the door. No messages, no alerts. So we didn't ignore the warnings, we just never got them. And I think that that's really important when you're working with people after disasters, because sometimes there is this assumption that people should have been more prepared, but in a lot of cases, that's just not the reality. For us, look, Tropical Cyclone Jasper itself, it wasn't actually that bad a cyclone. Living in Far North Queensland, we're pretty used to cyclones. So most people were prepared for it, rode it out, cleaned up, and was just waiting for things to go back to normal. However, a few days later, everything changed quite dramatically and quite quickly from that. And I'm not going to walk you through the whole experience, but I just want to share one moment because I think that it says more than anything else I could explain. It was just before daylight, and I'd been up all night watching the water slowly rising, still not really believing that it would ever reach the house. I woke my kids as calmly as I could, and I said, we're just going to go next door to their house because it's higher. The water's getting a bit too close now. And my youngest child took one look outside and he just completely panicked. He started hyperventilating, running through the house, grabbing toys, dropping them, picking up other toys, and he was begging me to not let him drown. And that moment has stayed with me more than anything else. Not losing the house, not the belongings, that moment. Because in that moment, I wasn't a professional. I was just a mother trying to hold it together while everything around us was going underwater. And there was nothing I could do to stop it or to make anything better in that moment. And within a few hours, our home was gone. And the reason why I share that moment with you all today is not for sympathy, but it's because that's what sits underneath the clients that you're all working with who are affected by disasters. And most of the time, you won't see that part because people choose to not share that. What really surprised me, though, even working in the community sector, is that the disaster doesn't end when the water recedes. It's actually when a lot of the hard work really just gets started. The days and the weeks after a disaster, they're a complete blur. Whole communities go into shock. People are exhausted, they're displaced, they're trying to figure out where they're going to sleep, what they're going to eat, and how they're even going to start again. And then the systems start to kick in. And disaster recovery hubs are obviously set up. And I want to be really, really clear is that the people working in them are doing an incredible job under really, really difficult circumstances, but they are also overwhelmed, especially if it's a large-scale natural disaster. There are really long wait times. And one thing that really stood out to me was the lack of privacy. I remember I walked into a recovery hub a few days later thinking that I was doing okay, as I'd held it together in the meantime. But as soon as I got in there, I broke down. But I couldn't really speak properly. And the reason why is, for me, is that there were people everywhere and from my own community. So when you come from small regional communities, everybody knows everybody. So the people in there, they could see me, they could hear me, and everything's out in the open. There's nowhere private that you can go to talk. So in my case, I just pulled myself back together and said what I needed to say on the surface, and I left. And that's something that's really stayed with me in my work, because what looks like someone's coping, it's often just someone who doesn't feel safe enough to not cope in that moment. And that then comes the part that many of you all are directly involved in, and that's the financial recovery. And I can say from experience that this is one of the most stressful parts of the entire process. Insurance in particular, it can feel like an uphill battle. It's slow, it's complex, and when you're already exhausted and overwhelmed, it can feel almost impossible to navigate. And even with my background, I really struggled. We were placed in emergency accommodation that was costing $450 a night because there were no other options at that time. And that's quite common in regional and rural areas. And knowing that that would come out of our insured amount, we made what we thought was a really practical decision to purchase a caravan, live on our property, keep the kids in their school, and manage our animals while we rebuilt our home. And it made sense to us, but our insurer refused, instead suggesting that we move 45 minutes away, rehome our animals, and even change our children's schools. I pushed back really hard. I escalated. I gathered evidence. I went through the complaints process and I got absolutely nowhere. So we made a decision to move back into our flooded home and camp there. It had been stripped out to about 1.5 meters, so it was essentially just a shell with nothing in it. North Queensland, you're dealing with insects, snakes, heat, torrential rain, all of it. And at that time, you actually still got to go to work. You've still got to parent, and you've still got to advocate for yourself with your insurance company. And this is where your role becomes so important, because what changed everything for us, it actually wasn't me pushing harder. It was advocacy. A new financial counsellor within our organisation recognised how serious our situation was, and she connected us with a senior financial counsellor who could step in at the right level. And within 24 hours of that happening, our claim was escalated and we were offered proper support, and we were finally treated like people and not just another claims number. So same situation, completely different outcome. And that experience has stayed with me, and it's fundamentally changed how I work. I don't take "they seem fine" at face value anymore. I pay a lot more attention to whether someone actually feels safe enough to be honest. And I think a lot more about timing, about not pushing people before they are ready. And probably the biggest shift I focus on is connection before solutions. Because before people are ready to engage with systems, paperwork, and financial decisions, they need to feel seen, heard, and supported. And advocacy, it's what you all do. It's such a powerful tool. You're not just helping people understand forms or processes, you're actually helping them navigate systems that feel overwhelming. You're pushing back when things aren't right, and you're humanizing people and systems that can sometimes lose sight of that. And that can completely change someone's outcome, just like it did for my family. And something else I've learned that is really important for those of you coming into this space is that you won't reach most disaster affected clients by sitting in a recovery hub and waiting for them to come to you. Some people will come, absolutely, but a lot won't come because they're overwhelmed. They don't want to sit in a room full of people with no privacy. They don't think they need help yet, or they just don't have the capacity to engage in that environment at that time. Where you will reach people is through your community. So through local organizations, community centers, schools, outreach workers, these are the places that people already know and already trust. In our area, it was those existing relationships between services that made the biggest difference. Word of mouth, soft referrals, someone saying, "Hey, go and talk to this person, they'll help you." And that's how people get connected. So if you're entering financial counselling or you're in financial counselling, especially in the disaster context, one of the most valuable things that you can do isn't just learn systems, it's build the relationships, because that's what's most important. Get to know your local services, be visible, and work alongside the people already on the ground, because they're often the bridge between you and the people who need you the most. And when you do connect with someone, don't underestimate the power of just being there. You don't need to have all the answers straight away. You don't need to fix everything. Just showing up, sitting with someone in that space and listening, it matters more than what you probably realize. If there's one thing I'd want you to take away from what I've said today, it's this: don't wait for people to come to you, because often they won't do that. When people are overwhelmed, traumatized, and just trying to get through the day, they're not always walking into those recovery hubs, and they're not always reaching out for help. But they will connect with people, and they will connect with places that they already trust and they already have those relationships with. So your role isn't just about understanding the systems, it's about being part of that network. Build those relationships, work alongside your community, and being someone who others can link people to when they're ready. Behind every conversation you're having, there's usually a moment that you haven't seen, where everything fell out of control, just like that moment for me that I described at the beginning of my presentation. And the way you show up and how you connect is how people start to take some of that control back. So coming from someone who's been on the other side of it, that's what really matters. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you so much, Erin. That's an incredibly powerful story. And I think it really speaks to the idea of the very difficult experiences that everyone who goes through a disaster will be experiencing, the multiplicity of all of those impacts, you know, that it's not just one single thing that you can look at as an individual thing, that it's everything sitting on top of each other, and how vitally important those connections are, especially the connections that you've had before are. So how important localized services are. Now, we thank you to our gracious speakers because they have shaved off some time on their presentations, and it's meant that we have 15 minutes still for questions. I am going to make another embarrassing statement or omission today, and that is that my computer is going to force a software update in 9 minutes because I think we all know that sometimes we just have those days where nothing will work right despite your best intentions. And so if I disappear, Louise is going to very gratefully step in to moderate for me, and Monica will back her up and Laura will back her up as well. So hopefully it's not going to happen, but we all know these things do happen sometimes. Now, we already have some questions in the chat. I'll start with one of them, and as I've said before, we will go through all of the questions that we have in here so that we can compile some responses and send them out. But if you would prefer to ask your question over audio, you can also use the little electronic hand raising thing so we can see you. But I'll put this to all of the speakers and anyone can jump in. We have a question from Bianca saying, regarding underinsurance, how would you like to see insurers take a more proactive role in helping people understand the cost to rebuild to lift underinsurance, and what you see as the main drivers for underinsurance? I might start with Louise and then open it up to the other speakers, if that's okay.
Yep, thanks, Kate. And thanks for the question, Bianca. There's probably a number of components, and I think it's probably a nuanced answer. I'm going to start with the main drivers for underinsurance, and I think that is a reflection on unfortunately, the cost of premiums at the moment. And so often financial counsellors will meet people who are underinsured, and it'll be because they're choosing their level of insurance based on the premium they can actually afford. And again, cost of living crisis comes into this as premiums go up, and there's other factors pulling where their money needs to be. They have to make a decision about what they can actually afford. And similarly, I think you will see in the insurance sector people choosing the greatest possible excess they can take. Again, it's about bringing that premium and the cost of the insurance down. I also think that there's an issue, again, it depends whether looking at, I'm just going to say flood, storm and fire. I think for fire, there's a lack of potentially education for some people around requirements to rebuild to a code if their home is burnt down, and so therefore may not be taking the full account of the cost of the rebuild. We see inflationary pressures after disaster. So even if what was an adequate amount at a point in time is then not sufficient at the time of the disaster. So I think I'll let others add to it, but I think there's actually a whole host of reasons that play into that. And perhaps it's being able to have those discussions on an annual basis with your customers in a meaningful way about where they sit at a particular time with the insurance cover that they have or that they feel that they need to choose.
Thank you. Thanks, Louise. Lisa, just from the perspective that you've seen on the ground, or even Erin jumping in, is there anything that you would add to Louise's response that you hear differently?
No, in the region here, yes, insurance and the capacity to be able to afford insurance is completely out of people's hands, and has been for a long time, because we're in a flood zone, and so it's been one of the major catalysts for people's incapacity to rebuild. And you know, it does question. For me, there's a question around the bank's responsibilities too, where a mortgage has been allowed on property that's in a flood zone, and the cost of that insurance and who is to carry that. But yeah, I think definitely the insurance piece is really important, and I know Louise has done a lot of work in that. But there's still so much more that we need to question and challenge, I think.
Thanks, Lisa. I might ask one of the other questions here, and then I'll hand to Lisa first, and then Erin, if there was anything that you wanted to add from your region's perspective. Alex Hanlon is asking, does the declaration of a state of emergency make it easier to negotiate with utility providers in affected areas? And should there be a code of practice on this that obliges utility providers to limit their billing?
Yes, I think something needs to be done, because across the board, a lot of the utility companies, when we did advocate very early on, had no awareness of the disaster in the region. A lot of the people that you were speaking to either are in a different state or in a different country, and so there's no awareness. So I think how that gets coordinated, I don't know. Each energy company is different, but I think the comment by Alex absolutely makes a lot of sense to have some sort of declaration of state of emergency, because people that don't know of financial counsellors or know that they have the capacity to advocate for themselves or can challenge the bill, it's difficult, and people are already in a state of hardship, already in a state of trauma, and to then have to negotiate with a utility company on a bill for usage of electricity when the house is still has no electricity at all and is still in disrepair. It's unconscionable, I think, and it puts people through so much more pressure than unnecessary.
Erin?
And it's kind of can target vulnerabilities as well, I think. So yeah, I think it's important that I think something needs to be looked at in that space too.
Erin, is that an issue that you've experienced in your region?
Yeah, look, with the electricity, being in a regional area, we only have one service provider for electricity, so they can pretty much charge what they like. There's no competition. And what a lot of people don't realize is when you lose your property during a flood, if you're insured, they put drying equipment in your house, and the drying out equipment can run for months, which it did in our case, and you're still paying for that electricity bill. So we were getting electricity bills for, nearly $2,000, and you do get that money eventually from your insurance company, but it's a process. So it's really definitely something that needs to be looked at. Absolutely.
Can I add a comment to that, Kate, as well? I think the other thing which I think can be particularly difficult with utilities and often telcos as well is that the impacted resident is not speaking to the same person, and every time they ring to self-advocate, they are being forced to retell their story, and that is on top of the financial stresses and being overwhelmed. So that's a real challenge for people.
That's a great point. Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Erin. There are a number of other comments in here, and Erin, there's one specifically for you, but I think I'm going to send that on to you because it's quite a detailed one. But Monica, I'd like to throw this one to you. Building on the discussion about advocacy, do any of the speakers have any suggestions on how we can better coordinate post-disaster data collection and advocacy so impacted people don't have to repeatedly tell their stories to multiple organisations?
I did not see that question. But in terms of advocacy, I mean, here we are, post-disaster data collection. So, I mean, I think organisations coming together and networking in coalition to do sort of collective advocacy projects can be really effective and powerful. And yeah, the data tells the story. I think there are ways that organisations have, designed their work in ways that, yeah, people aren't having to kind of repeatedly over and over again tell their story to multiple organisations. But in terms of individual initiatives, I don't sort of have anything to kind of really share. I wanted to also just very quickly, if I could, pick up on that point about the code of conduct and the utility companies, and that sort of really goes to the system preparedness issue when systems aren't sort of designed for disasters. So absolutely, I think utilities companies as well, it's that systemic preparedness stuff that it's absolutely predictable that that's going to be a problem, in the same way that breaches of Centrelink, those things are going to be problems. And so these sort of systems and agencies can put in place structures so that when the disaster hits, it's not going to be a problem. But yeah, I'll throw to the others if they've got any sort of specific ideas around the data collection piece.
In this region, we've had a lot of organisations working together because it was so extensive of providing lists of emergency relief or lists of services available, and that's something for what I think a regional collective sort of processes in place, so that we do, this is an area of regular floods, so how do we activate next time, what do we do better next time around, and a lot of it is around the collaborating, but also having that interconnectedness of services. I think data collection is difficult, but I think the warm referrals and having those ability to be able to actively and very quickly provide a warm referral, which is where a person isn't having to retell their story over and over. And I think that's that advocacy piece where the services in the region work more collaboratively together, so that then we can work with the system for those individuals that come to each of us individually, and then work through the system that way. I think is, for me, it feels like that's best practice. And I think is the system that we work through here in the region that I think is has certainly worked. After post-flood, we had Cyclone Alfred, and that happened. We all came together collaboratively, and within the services, individuals were then able to activate that interconnectedness and data sharing, or information sharing, I guess.
Thanks, Lisa. Now, I'm incredibly surprised that I haven't been kicked out of my computer yet, so I'll just keep going. And I'll paraphrase one of the questions that is in here, and I'll ask Louise, but maybe Erin, if you can touch on, based on your experience, any personal views on this. And that is, we know that financial counsellors get activated in different ways in different disasters, and they might be coming to recovery centres or service centres in different ways after different disasters. Maybe, Louise, you can provide a little bit of context to that, and Erin, you can talk about, based on your personal experience and some of the sort of advice and recommendations you had there, anything you'd like to add in it.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. I'm not sure who raised that question. Access to recovery hubs is, in my opinion, vital for financial counsel during that response phase. The emergency response is state-based, and so every state operates differently, and that means that financial counsellors in each state at the moment have different opportunities to access the hubs. It is something that, as the national peak, we're working very hard with the state peaks as well, to get access for financial counsellors to hubs in every state across the country. So that is difficult. Whilst the hubs are very similar, they also will operate slightly differently. And so the role the financial counsellor might play might be slightly different. Some financial counsellors are allowed to do outreach outside of the hubs, other financial counsellors aren't. So it is fairly nuanced. I think from my perspective, from the national perspective, what we're looking to see is that consistency and approach of financial counsellors when they are in the hub, so that we know that the work they're doing is effective, and it's appropriate as well.
Thanks. And Erin, just in the last minute, any last words you'd like to say on that?
Yeah, look, in our area being a regional area, and the fact that disaster was such large scale that no one could really prepare for due to the lack of warning, the recovery hubs in my particular area were very basic. So there was the Red Cross and there was Centrelink. That was about it. And then there was eventually the council came in, the local council, you know, with some Christmas presents because we were a week out of Christmas, and local community centres came in with some basic food supplies and things like that. And there was a water truck because there was no water either. Yeah, so it is hard. I think it's more when these disasters happen in these regional areas to get to try and get to these hubs is really important. And I'd be more steering towards engaging with those community centres in regional and rural areas because they have those contacts, and that's probably the easiest way in to get to those, in my opinion, anyway.
Thanks so much, Erin. Now, thank you to all of our speakers. You've done a magnificent job, especially after the format was thrown out a bit and the start times were thrown out a bit. To everyone who was able to join us, thank you so much. Thank you so much for persisting in spite of the tech issues and coming along, putting in your questions and listening to what our speakers have to say. We will be providing a link to the recording and a summary of any of the questions that were asked. We'll make sure our speakers have a chance to compile some responses to it. Thank you so much to everyone for today. We really appreciate it.